So we thought it was nonsense, and then when my mom went to the neighbor's bank, she goes, "Oh, you know what? I think there is some lights and darkness." Their house is across the street from sort of one of the houses, historic church.
Okay, guys, we're about to get started as a couple of people join us late. So thanks for coming. Welcome to Indie Publishing Austin. Today's topic with Leslie Watts is about developmental editing for fiction and nonfiction. Leslie is an editor I've known for a while now, and you're running your own business, right?
Yes.
LeslieWattsEditor.com. All right, great. So without further ado, turn it over to Leslie.
Hi everyone. I want to get a feel for who's here in the audience first, so that I can tailor my talk as much as possible to your needs. And I have the questions that were sent in, so that we can talk about those things. So those are definitely on the agenda, so don't worry about that. But first of all, I want to find out who here, nonfiction, who writes nonfiction? Okay, and who writes fiction? Okay, and who has worked with a developmental editor before? Okay, and who has done a developmental edit on their own? Okay, good. So I'm going to kind of run through some basic stuff, and then I'm going about developmental editing and why you should do it, and a little bit about working with an editor, not a lot. But then I'm going to talk about the beginnings and endings, which were questions that were asked ahead of time, and also some general pitfalls. And then there was a specific question. Did you ask the specific question? I want to make sure that we talk a little about that, because I think that well, I'm going to get to it, but there's more crossover between nonfiction and fiction than you would imagine. So when we get to the questions period, I want to encourage you to ask, even if you feel like it's a very specific question, because there is a lot of crossover, and there is a lot of things that apply to other things. So it could be very helpful to other people. So developmental editing. Everybody gets really excited about that, right? So this is also known as structural editing, also known as content editing. These are the bones of your book. And the thing about it is that I don't want anybody to get caught up. Like, if you're in the middle of a draft right now, I don't want you to get caught up in spinning about what I'm talking about, because this is all stuff that happens after you finished your draft. So I don't want you to worry about it while you're working on your rough draft, because you can get derailed. You can get, it can be discouraging. Oh, I have to go back and fix this thing. No, you need to get your rough draft down first, and then you can start to rip it apart and have fun with it. So I mentioned fiction and nonfiction, and the ways that they kind of overlap and meet each other in different ways. So you think of nonfiction books as providing information, perhaps, or solving a problem, but in an interesting way, fiction also solves problems. Fiction grapples with those problems that are more fiction grapples with emotional problems, and it grapples with relationship problems, and also the ways that that society is, and that we want to change it, and all of that. So I don't want you to think when we're talking about nonfiction that there's no crossover to fiction, because there is. And when we're talking about fiction, I want you to understand that a nonfiction book is also telling a story if it's going to be compelling. Even a book that is strictly about, a topic. For example, I'm going to pull something out of the air, something about, say, energy efficiency and solar power. Like, even within that you think is going to be a fairly straightforward thing, you can tell a story that makes it more compelling, helps the reader keep going, because we've all read boring nonfiction books, haven't we, that are like, oh, I need this information, but it is like pulling teeth. So you want to make the experience for your reader as enjoyable as possible. And so I want to hammer that home, really, that nonfiction, fiction, whatever, we have a lot to learn from each other. So the other thing I want to talk about before I get started and get into the meat of this is that, some people we get in the dichotomy of pantsers and plotters, people who write by the seat of their pants, or they're also called organic, they're also called gardeners, I think. And then you have people who are plotters, who are, they kind of work out to a greater or lesser extent what they're going to write about before they start writing. And for some people, the story is really innate, and the structure is really innate, and so they don't necessarily work that way where they start planning things out ahead of time. But one of the things that is going on when you're plotting or when you're outlining in advance is that you are pre-editing to a certain extent. So it's something to consider. So that now I'm going to get into that sort of the nitty-gritty of developmental editing, because that's what you're all like on the edge of your seats waiting for. Why do we do developmental editing first? Why does that come first? Because you want to fix the structure, right? You don't want to polish a section or a chapter or a paragraph or a scene when you are going to have to cut it or change it substantially. You want to get, before you're messing with the language, you want to make sure that all the bones are there and that they're in the right places. So think about it that way, that you've got bones in your story, and if they're in the wrong place, or if you have two right arm bones, or that you're going to have, there's going to be problems, and you're not going to be able to work those out by making the prose pretty or making the prose correct, grammatically correct. So this is why we look at this first, and we go into developmental editing before we look at copy editing. So then I want to talk for just a moment too about why you might consider hiring a developmental editor, and then I'm going to be quiet about that. You're welcome to ask me questions. I am not putting no hard sell, none of that today. If you have questions, you feel free to email me. But I feel really strongly that that hiring a developmental editor will help you create the very best book you can, because your developmental editor will see things that you cannot see because you're so close to your work. And they will also point out things that you don't know about. And that it's just really helpful when you are struggling with your story and you don't know what's wrong, to find somebody who can say, oh, I see what's wrong. You have the midpoint, but nothing changes here. You get to the middle of the story and nothing really happens. And so if you can find somebody might, read your book and say, yeah, it was okay. It kind of worked for me, but it didn't, they won't be able to necessarily tell you what is wrong and what you can fix. And so that's why it's really helpful to have a developmental editor to go through your work and help you with those things. Now, some people are like, no, I'm never going to hire a developmental editor. I'm just not into that. The story is the story. And I get that. And I think that I think some people do. They just are the structure, and they can pour it out on the page and all of that. I think some people, though, are afraid about what they might learn about their story, afraid that they might have to rewrite the ending or rewrite, God forbid, the middle, the entire middle, or rework the beginning, and then that means everything has to change. And So what I would say is don't be afraid of that. It's easier to say than, than to just, right? It's easier to say than do. But try to maintain an open mind about that, because what you really want is to take what's in your mind and your heart and share it with someone else. And the best way to do that is to burn away the stuff that doesn't work. And your developmental editor can help you do that. So the other sticking point, I think, with developmental editing is that editing can be expensive, and that especially if you're just starting out, that it's hard to justify that expense. And so what I would suggest is there are a few things that you can do. There are some great resources, and I'll share these again later so you have them, but the Story Grid by Sean Coyne is a great fiction book, and there's a podcast that goes with that that's really excellent. So on the fiction side, and Kathy Yardley has a book called Rock Your Revisions, which is also an excellent book on structure and working with your book after you have the rough draft. On the nonfiction side, there is, I'm going to recommend Sean Coyne again, but I'm going to direct you to his website. He deconstructed Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point, and it's amazing. It's all on his website for free. You can just follow the breadcrumbs, and he talks about the different genres within nonfiction, and he talks about the same kinds of things that he talks about in fiction. You have obligatory scenes, you have certain conventions for a how-to book, for an academic book, for a memoir, that you want to make sure is in your book. And so that's a great resource. And then I also like Developmental Editing by Scott Norton. That's another great resource. So if you're struggling with, I gotta pay my rent, I gotta, the cat needs shots, whatever, those kinds of things, then I want you to know that there are things that you can do to help improve your book while you're waiting for the time when you can hire a developmental editor. And then the other thing I wanted to suggest about that is that you can also, you can get your outline reviewed for a much lower price than having your entire manuscript reviewed. So that's another way to cut the cost of a developmental edit and still get some of the benefit. So now I want to dive a little into basic structure. And I'm going to start with fiction, but as I said, nonfiction people don't tune it out, because you also need to tell a story. And the structure actually for a nonfiction book is quite similar in most cases. So you need a beginning hook, right? You need something that is going to pull the reader in, get them interested. This is often a question. Often, like in a murder mystery, it's who done it. In a romance, it's are they going to get together? And in a thriller, it's oh my gosh, is this person going to survive or face something worse than death? So you have. That's also a horror film, horror story. So you have these questions, and a lot of times your genre will kind of point you in a general direction about what your question or your hook will be. And then after you have the beginning hook, right, you have this is what Sean Coyne calls increasing complications, right? These are the series of events that your character, your protagonist, goes through that helps them grow internally, grow and change for their character arc. And it also brings them closer to or farther away from their external goals. So in a romance, you have a protagonist. We're going to say it's the woman, say in a heterosexual relationship. And if the woman is the protagonist and she really wants to get together with this guy, but there are all these things that get in the way. Maybe it's family, maybe it's work, maybe they have some value conflict, but you have this series of conflicts that carries you through that big middle chunk of the book. And so when you get to the end of these increasing complications, then you reach a sort of crisis, this moment where there's a question, and the question, comes down to like the best, or the, what is it? Let me look, because it's escaping me this way. Okay, you have the best of two bad choices, right? Or you have two irreconcilable goods. So you have two great situations. Oh, again, we'll take our romance. The woman has this opportunity to take the job of her dreams that she's always wanted and always worked for, and it suddenly lands in her lap, but it's going to take her halfway around the world and away from her beloved man. But also she has, like he at that moment has said, oh yes, let's go and have a relationship. So she has to choose, ostensibly, she has to choose between those two situations, those two great situations, two things she wants. On the other hand, it could be two bad, the best of two bad options. So that could be, again, romance, let me think, could be she has to, now I'm drawing a blank. Let me go to a mystery. Okay, so in a mystery, you have the protagonist has been investigating the crime and gathering clues, following the threads, and then reaches a point where she has to do something. She either has to let the bad guy go, or she has to do something that is contrary to her values or contrary to her character, or she has to do something that she doesn't think she's capable of, that kind of thing. So that's kind of, it's those kinds of questions, those kinds of dilemmas that you see at that point. And then all of that leads toward the climax, where the protagonist makes the decision and has to, and then then everything unfolds in that way. So that's the basic structure, right, of your fiction story. And then within that, you have smaller portions, right? You have the acts within the story, you have scenes within the acts. And so within all of that, you have the repeating structure of the beginning hook, the increasing complications, the crisis question, the climax, and then ultimately the resolution. How does this work out? Okay, so in shifting gears, nonfiction, this works in a similar way. You have a problem, right, that people want to solve generally, or you're telling a story like a memoir, or you're telling a story like literary nonfiction. I'm thinking about Seabiscuit, those kinds of stories. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks? Yeah. Okay, so stories like that, those are going to read more like a story, like a fiction story. But if you're talking about a straight up nonfiction, problem solving, informing people about something, then it's more of the what's the problem, what's the thing that you want to introduce people. You still need that beginning hook, because otherwise people don't know to keep reading. They need to place themselves squarely within your audience, and so you need to set that up that way so that they know who you're talking to. And then in your nonfiction book, your increasing complications are things like evidence and things like anecdotes, and they are we use the Greek terms ethos, pathos, and logos that are, the ethos is the you have the qualifications, the credentials to talk about this thing. Logos is you're appealing to people's sense of logic, and then pathos is, you're appealing to their heart. And so you're weaving all of those things in during what we call the increasing complications in fiction. That's what you're doing with nonfiction. And along the way, sharing the steps that people take to solve the problem. And then essentially the crisis question in a nonfiction book is implied in that you are, will you or won't you follow this advice? Will you or won't you apply my solution to it? And I think presenting the question almost that directly is a really great technique, because you're kind of pulling people, because it's really easy for people to read a lot of nonfiction books and think, oh, that's a great idea, but not do anything about it. And so I think that's a really lovely way to kind of focus them and bring them to them, because the more powerful the book is, the better able they are to apply your solutions, the more they're going to talk about it to their friends and family and colleagues. And so you really want to make your book effective so that it'll sell more, right? Like, that's kind of the bottom line. So then, then you invite them to make a decision, and then you tell them, like, where to from here. Like, once you've made the decision, this is the thing you follow. So that's another way to just to look at nonfiction books, the self-help, the how-to, that kind of thing. So that's basic structure. And I want to talk about then, just quickly, because I want to get to the beginnings and the endings, because those are my favorites. Someone, who was it that asked about pitfalls and common problems and, oh, okay, good. Okay, so I just want to put a face to that. So the things, I don't really have any pet peeves, which is interesting for developmental editing. It's more, to me, it's like a seek and find puzzle. And so it's looking for things like, where is there no conflict? Like, is there conflict throughout? Is there a big conflict in fiction? Or is there conflict in every scene? That is a big problem in fiction. But it's also kind of a problem in nonfiction, because you want to keep people engaged. You want to keep people understanding that they need to keep reading, because they're going to gather all that they need to solve the problem. And so you need to understand, like, they need to understand the conflict at every level. So every chapter, every section, like, what's the problem here? What's this aspect of the problem? And what's the conflict? What gets in the way of solving it? That kind of thing. So lack of structure. So when you take all of your knowledge and just on the page, which is awesome for a first draft, but you want to then work it into a structure and make sure that it works, right? So, because if it doesn't work as a story, if it doesn't work as a nonfiction book, then it's not going to work. Again, you can't polish something that's not that where there isn't a structure, where there isn't a good story. And then I would say the next thing is lack of transitions. Like, people will move from thing to thing to thing without a smooth kind of, this is where we are, this is where we're going. And it doesn't have to be that explicit, but it has to be in there so that people are able to, to follow along. Another thing that you're really working toward is improving the reader's experience. And when you create transitions that flow smoothly, then the reader has a much more pleasant experience and is willing to sit through all of it, even if there are rough patches. And then the other thing I would say is consistency throughout the book. Fiction, consistency in voice, consistency in there was a book I worked on recently that had point of view slips. So where you're going, so in fiction, just for the uninitiated, you're doing this in nonfiction too. You're telling the story from a particular point of view, and within a story you can switch points of the point of view character, but you need to make sure that there's a good transition. Otherwise, the person doesn't know through whose filter they are viewing the world and the happenings of the story. So consistency is another important thing, and something I see. Okay, now it's time for beginnings. I thought about switching them, about doing the endings first, because that's kind of the order that they came in, but I'll humor you. A good developmental editor shouldn't mess around that way. So the importance of the beginning, obviously, again, the beginning hook, the thing that pulls the reader into the story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, that's really important. And so you want to grab the reader. If you are submitting your work to an agent or an acquisitions editor at a publishing company, your beginning has to be really good. So, and this is the Indie Austin meetup, so that might not be as important. But what is important is that you put that book up on Amazon and people can read the first 10% and get a feel for your book, and they will either be enthralled or they will not be. And if they are not, they will not come back and they will not buy your book from the sample. So it's really, really important, that your beginning has everything that's necessary and really pulls them in. So you need a great first line, which is, mostly people think of that as copy editing, but to me that's like the first line should contain everything you need to know about the book, right? It's not the log line, but it is something that represents the theme, something that represents the journey that the protagonist takes, or that that you as the reader will take in solving your problem in a nonfiction world. And so I think it's really important that you think of that as part of the structure. The last line for endings is the same way their book ends. And then you need to introduce the main character, obviously, in the beginning, and you need to make that person really lovable, or at least intriguing or relatable. And again, that's fiction. Nonfiction, right? We were just talking a few minutes ago about how Malcolm Gladwell is essentially a character in his nonfiction books. And you see that Tim Ferriss, Matt also mentioned, that you see people, I think Gretchen Rubin, who does the Happiness Project and a couple of other books that are similar, that she's a character in those books. And you don't necessarily need that, to become fully a character in your self-help or how-to book, but think about, consider how that might help. How it might, or an example of somebody going through the process of what you're, of the advice that you're offering, someone who has the problem you're trying to solve, and kind of walking through that, because it's really nice to give the reader a story they can relate to in that regard. So you want to, obviously, in the beginning, introduce the conflict in a fiction book, and in nonfiction, you want to introduce the problem. So that should be all, that should all be included in there. And I want to say about fiction, just a kind of an aside, that you don't always reach the main conflict right away, but you need some kind of conflict that sort of bridges the beginning to the main conflict. So that you're not, so that they're not like, we're not all hanging out in a manor house in England for our cozy mystery. We're just hanging out until the body shows up. No, you have to have some sort of conflict, and it's really awesome if that bridging conflict is something that relates to the bigger conflict. It should really relate to that bigger conflict, or be a small microcosm kind of thing. I gave an example on the book editor show the other week about how I don't know if you have kids or if you've seen the show Wonder Pets. The Wonder Pets? No. Oh, okay, that's too bad. It's a great show for little kids. And what's cool about it is in the opening, so the premise is that these 3 little classroom animals, there's a little turtle, and there's a little guinea pig, and a little duck. And they're classroom pets. And they go save other animals, usually baby animals. So it's the Wonder Pets save the baby elephant. And so in the beginning, they have to get their vehicle ready. And there's always a little problem, always some sort of conflict in getting the flyboat ready to go. And so whatever that conflict is and the solution that they find to it is connected to, or is like, it's an echo of the main conflict of the story and the solution that they use. Hey, remember when we did that thing back with the flyboat? Yeah, so it's that kind of thing, and that's a really simplistic example, but that's the kind of thing that you can use in your story and that you can look at when you're doing a developmental edit. So, really important stuff. Okay, so openings also, promises that I'm going to deliver a solution to your problem, promises I'm going to show you how to do this thing, promises that at the end, you will know who done it, and you will know how these two get together if it's a romance, because that's a required convention, right? A love story, they don't have to get together. Romance, they do. So, in case you're not familiar with those things. But yeah, so you're making a promise with your genre and with your opening, and you're going to need to reference that and come back to that at the end and make sure that you're delivering on that. So you have stuff to avoid in the beginning. No info dumps, right? Info dumps, big blocks of information, particularly in fantasy, science fiction, speculative fiction, where you're building a world. You love this world so much, and you really need to tell everyone all the details about it, down to this is how they use their debit cards. So, I mean, and that's all. It can be interesting, can be fodder. Do not dump it all on the reader in the beginning, because it's, and some people will say, well, Tolkien did it. Yep, he did it. But he was a trailblazer, essentially. Like, he was showing us how this kind of story writing is done. And so he kind of needed to say, well, this is hobbits, because nobody had encountered hobbits before. And so, the other thing I would say is that you can find a lot of examples of people doing things that developmental editors and other people against the conventional wisdom. And sometimes that works. And sometimes, well, that's Stephen King. And he can do that because he has a huge following already. And a lot of, so popular writers can break some of those rules, and as long as the story works, then you may break those rules too. It's sometimes hard to do those things well. It's sometimes hard to break the rules well. So that's another reason to have some help, and another reason to just be cognizant of what people expect and make an intentional decision about whether you're going to follow the convention or not. So overly long descriptions, you want to avoid that also. Avoiding when you're grounding the reader in your setting, whether nonfiction, fiction, You don't want to spend too long on it. You want to give them a few hints and then unfold over the course of the story. And then starting too early, starting too late. There's this great quote from Kristen Lamb. Your inciting incident should occur where the agenda of the antagonist intersects the life of the protagonist. So that's again, just a general rule, but think about how, where you are starting your story, like where you're encountering the protagonist versus when stuff starts getting going. And then you want to, oh, yes, and this is, I don't know if you've seen the Stephen Pressfield's latest book. Are we allowed to say, okay. I'm gonna not, because I see there are young people in our midst. So the book is Nobody Wants to Read Your Stuff. Okay, and it's Stephen Pressfield's latest book, and it's full of really good stuff. So if you haven't gotten it, get a copy of it because it's really awesome. And the advice that I want to take from him and, to apply to beginnings is to pare your stuff down. No fluff. Kill your darlings, as Faulkner and King both say, because your darlings are not actually going to help you. You need to make it interesting. You need to make it so, you need to think of your ideal reader. And what do they find fascinating? What do they find interesting? What do they find fun? What do they find inappropriate word here? So also think about the emotion that you're trying to evoke for your reader, and all of that stuff. Like those are things that need to be in your beginning. And then I have and then I have a caveat. Because I want you to know this, that just because a bunch of agents or a bunch of editors or anybody says this is the way it has to be, that is not necessarily the way it has to be. So again, conventions, there are these things that the reader expects, and the important thing is whether it works or not. And then what I want to say is that is to think about what the principle is underlying the rule or the convention or the wisdom about it. And if your story fits that, then consider it. If your story doesn't, isn't running afoul of those, of the principle behind the rule, then feel free to, go forth and sin in that way. Okay, endings. And ending. So ending, this is the big payoff, right? This is where everything gets delivered, all the stuff that your reader has been anticipating. You wrap it up in a lovely package and give it to them. But how you give it to them is really important. And what you deliver is really important. So you need to answer that question from the beginning hook. You need to make sure that's answered. And understand that the reader wants closure, right? The reader wants to have some feeling like, some cathartic moment. And there can be different levels of this. If you have a series, you can leave some stuff unresolved, for sure. And even if you have a standalone book, that is fine, to leave some questions open, some things unknown. Just think about your story and what's appropriate based on what you promised at the beginning. And then what I want to say too is that I want to share this quote from Desirina Boscovich. The right ending isn't always the ending the reader wants. So consider that sometimes people are, sometimes we tell people what they want in the beginning and we give them what they need. And sometimes that isn't exactly what they want. And that's true of a nonfiction book as much as a fiction book. that sometimes you're delivering the hard truth. And I think that Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point is a great example of that, because he walks through telling you how these how things go viral. But then in the end, he says we really need to consider whether we should be setting out to do that on purpose, and whether this is a good thing for our society. So sometimes giving people what they need versus what they want is good. So components of a great ending obviously resolves the story's main conflict one way or another. Again, might be a good thing for the protagonist. Protagonist might get what they want. They might not. In a nonfiction book, generally you want to give the people what you said you're going to deliver. It's, self-help, how-to. You don't want to say, oh, sorry, there actually isn't a solution. That would not do well. So, in fiction, you want your main character driving the resolution of the story. You don't want somebody swooping in at the last minute and saving them and solving their problems. That's not. It's not a satisfying ending. You want a satisfying ending, and a satisfying ending is both inevitable, meaning you answer the question that you asked in the beginning in a way that is obvious, right? Will they or won't they get together? They're going to get together, but there may be a cost, right? The protagonist in the mystery solves the mystery. She finds out who done it. Oh, too bad it was her favorite uncle, or something like that. It doesn't have to be happy, but it has to be resolved. And in a way that makes sense, so that the reader doesn't think that you just pulled the wool out from under them. Wool over their eyes, rug out from under them. Okay.
Could have been a wool rug.
I'm mixing metaphors, and it's not. Yeah. All right, that's not working. So you want it to be inevitable, but you also want it to be surprising. And so what you want to do there is innovate. Do not take the first idea that comes to you. The first idea that comes to you, in fact, I will say pretty safely, the first 5 to 7 ideas that come to you are a rehash of stuff you've already read or watched in a story. And those were great, right? Those were awesome. Then you have to do something that's a little bit different, that's special, that's, for your story. Now, how do you innovate? I think that, one thing you can do is ask write 10, make a list of 10 potential outcomes, and then write each one out. You don't have to write the whole, 10 chapters or whatever, but just write, how would that unfold? Okay, so if it's, if it's this person, or if it's revealed this way, okay, that's one thing. And then keep going, because the deeper you go into it, the more that the closer you're going to get to something that's flowing from your own creativity and not from your memory. And I want to say, I know a lot of people like to do the typey, but I'm going to suggest, when you're really trying to get into the your heart and your story, and to get that really innovative ending, I'm going to say pull out a fast pen and write on paper, because you're going to get different things. And set a timer and write without editing, without revising, without crossing out. Don't worry about spelling, punctuation, and all that. You're not worrying about that stuff during the rough draft, right? Nobody's worrying about spelling and grammar and punctuation. Okay, good. So yeah, that's what I want to say about the inevitable but surprising ending, is to just keep drilling down into that story until you find the thing where you're like, oh yeah, till you have that result, that cathartic moment that you want your reader to have. Because when you have it, you'll know that you'll be able to deliver it. So, other components, you need a revelation, right? the main character has to have learned something or revealed something about the world, or like some nugget of information that they didn't have at the beginning. And yeah, okay. Other things that you want to include in your ending, you want to make sure that the character's inner journey and their outer journey are coming together at the same time. You don't want them to be over here and over here. You want all of that to come together in one big... No, you don't need explosions, but something like that. The functional equivalent of an explosion in your world, in your story. There should be a sense as you're coming to your ending that things are closing down, that options are being, tossed away, that things, that there are diminishing opportunities to do something different. And then you want to, of course, work toward that climax, that the crisis question, the climax, that big decision. It can be a battle, right? It can be, whatever that is. You want to make that bigger again, innovate. Like, spend time making that. How can I make this bigger? How can I make the stakes higher? How can I make it? It can't be that the protagonist can just go back to the way things were. That's not a story. That's, I don't know. What is it? It's a vignette, or I don't know what it is. It's not really a story because it doesn't, the character has to change in some way. They can't just go back to the way things were. So you really need to make sure that you're foreclosing options as you go, especially at the end. And then, okay, other thoughts on innovating, because I know I need to wrap up and give you time for questions. Use the elements in your story, like on the podcast the other day, we were talking about how there was a champagne bottle and it got shaken up, and then it popped, and it was a lovely metaphor for what was happening in the scene. And I asked the author about it, and I said, did you do that intentionally? And she said, no, it just kind of happened. And so that's the kind of stuff that happens when you innovate and you're using just objects and whatever else. You want to have like echoes of the motif and the theme that have in the beginning. Like, think of the Wizard of Oz and how we go back to Kansas and then we meet all the people again. And those people are those people are within the story, within that middle part of the story are the same people who were at the beginning and the same people who were at the end. And you don't have to do that. You don't have to use the same people necessarily, but you're using people in the same role. So some person plays the person with the huge heart who doesn't think they have it, and some person is the person who doesn't think they're very brave, but they're actually very courageous, and those kinds of things. So using those roles and repeating those kinds of things as you go. You can reveal the opening to be a sham, or reveal an alternate reality. Has everybody seen The Sixth Sense? Right? So how that it's like, whoa, and it was totally, it all worked, but it was a completely, it was a great twist on our perceptions and how we were viewing that. And then I want to say, if you get to your ending and you're working on it and you find, you get to that cathartic moment where you're having that, then I don't want you to worry that you haven't laid the foundation for that, because you can go back through the book. And it doesn't take as long, usually, it doesn't take as long as you might think to plant the seeds of that really awesome ending in your book. So, I'm going to stop talking about all that stuff now, and I want to talk about specific questions that you have, because There's a lot of information, and I know you probably have specific questions. So again, I want to say, don't worry if your question is very specific to your project and what you're working on, because generally someone else has had that question, or it can relate to other projects, other people's projects. So, who's got questions? Yes.
So, can the ending be in the epilogue, or should the ending be in the ending and then the epilogue be after?
That's a great question. So should the ending be in the epilogue, in an epilogue to the book, or should it be contained within the story? I think it needs to be contained in the story. The epilogue oftentimes is more of the resolution of the story. Like the resolution is, so if you're starting in the beginning, your story, you're talking about the character's ordinary world. The resolution is the bookend for that, and this is how we go forward. What is life gonna be like? This is a little clue, a little taste of what life is gonna be like. I think of an epilogue as more I think often it's when you have a series, the epilogue is a clue about the hook for the next book. It doesn't have to be, but I think it often is, and I think that's a really effective use of that. If you're wanting to have an epilogue, think about what purpose it's serving. Do you really need to put it separate, or should it all be contained in that, within the story? And the same thing goes for prologues. Prologues, you want to have a very specific reason for doing them, not just, oh, I would like a prologue too, because George R.R. Martin does that. And and not everybody likes it, but whatever. So the point being is that prologues serve a purpose. Oftentimes there'll be like a setup for the story that's in a different point of view, presenting events that set the story in motion long ago, that kind of thing. So you don't necessarily need that. But an introduction in a nonfiction book, I think you do need. Just an aside. Does that? Okay, cool.
Why do you need an introduction? Why do you need an introduction?
The introduction is what tells the person why they need to buy your book. Like that includes a little of your your credibility, your credentials, your experience, and that. A little, not a lot. You don't want to beat them over the head. But this is you belong here because I'm going to tell you about this problem, etc. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll also ask. So I was asking her before. I have a book that I've been working on and off. It was my nano. This is the sad story. It was my first nano novel.
Okay.
So it's not in 2013.
That's not sad.
Oh, no, it is sad because I had no idea what I was doing when I was writing it. I just wrote, like every day I just wrote. I had a general.
Everybody starts
I
there.
kind of knew something. I had no structure at all. No idea where it was going to end. So it sort of shows, right? And I've been trying to impose structure, and I can't. And it's a non-linear story. Like there's pieces that don't fit in a linear timeline and can go in different places. And so I was just like, what would a developmental editor do how would you approach something like that?
Yeah, so the question is about you have a story and you've worked on it and worked on it and worked on it, and you're trying to impose a structure. Maybe you didn't start with an outline. Maybe you did NaNoWriMo, which is awesome.
And you can do it with the structure, but that one I did not.
Yeah, right. And a lot of people, I think a lot of first-time novelists, was that your first one? No, that wasn't your first one.
It was just my first nano.
First
nano.
nano.
No, I didn't have a story in mind, and I sort of jumped into it.
Awesome. No, I think that's great. So when you have this manuscript, but you don't know what to do with it, you know that it's not working, then a developmental editor is a really great resource, because you can have, you can have beta readers, you can have people who, people read your book and give you feedback, and they might be able to tell you some stuff, but they probably can't tell you precisely what's wrong. They can say, I kind of got sleepy at this point, or this part was really interesting, but then something happened, and your developmental editor can tell you, oh, I know what's happening there, is that, that there's no conflict in this scene, and the people are just kind of, things are not hard enough for the protagonist. You're really supposed to make life hard for them. So that's what I would say, is that a developmental editor can help you figure out what's not working and kind of take it apart, find what's working, keep those parts, and give you suggestions about how to improve it, how to fix those problems. And that was something I wanted to mention too, is that looking at those books, those are great because they talk about basic structure and that kind of thing. But what a developmental editor can do for you is that they can work with your specific project, because no two stories are the same exactly. They shouldn't be. It's called plagiarism if they are. And so, but that's the point, that you can get a custom solution to your problem. And so, yeah, that's what I would do.
I have been with an agency and an agent and all that, and she was an editor also, and she sent out all her authors had to follow a specific set of agency guidelines for editing. And so, when it went through all the big 6 publishers and things, are your when you edit, is it like through a standard guidelines that you use, or what's the difference in how you developmental edit and then another editor? Is there like a common ground you have for editing, or is it just based on experience, or
Yeah, so the question is, that in traditional publishing with agents and acquisition editors, they have a sort of method, they have guidelines, that kind of thing. I think freelancers all do it differently. For me, I look at, I pull from everywhere. That's why I do all the editing. Like, I do the copy editing because I think it informs my developmental editing. There's structure in the sentences as well as the body of the work. And so I think everybody's a little different. I use the story grid a lot when I'm doing a developmental edit, just because it really speaks to me. But I also, like I said, I come up with unique things depending on what the project is. But I mean, it's always, based on what's the big structure, what are the smaller parts of structure, and what needs to be in there, and then what is this particular author trying to achieve with this book, and then go from there. Any more questions? Yeah.
Just a comment on that is, I have the same editor that does content editing and copy editing, and she has guidelines up there about language. And so she doesn't have guidelines at the developmental editing level, but definitely at the copy editing level. It's like Chicago manual of style, rules for this, that, and the other thing is the way she does it. So I don't know, maybe is more along those.
Well, she had her own. She was a developmental editor too, and had her own agency, and she had guidelines. And specifics as when you wrote your manuscript, and this is how it would be edited, and structure, and all this. But a lot of it was based on the publishing houses, what they would accept, and the genres. And I found out in writing, you better know what your genre, the guidelines or requirements of your genre are very specific. And if you don't know those, the chances of being picked up are very slim to none.
Right.
Genre.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is a big thing. And I didn't know that going into it. You know, so I kind of wondered, like, with developmental editing, is there a standard somewhere that everybody kind of looks to when you submit your book, even, you know, for indie publishing or to a traditional publisher or whatever? Is it just kind of a freewheeling, what everybody feels?
Yeah, whether there's a standard, I don't think, whether there's a standard for developmental editing, I don't think there is, other than looking at what's in the genre, what is working in the genre now. Certain, you know, conventions change over time. If you look at books that were published, like if you look at Dickens, probably wouldn't do so well today, even though it's great stuff. Everybody likes Dickens, right? Come on, everybody, right? Okay. So, but the point is, like, that conventions change, things move in and out of fashion, and that and within traditional publishing, you're going to get a lot more standard stuff than you are, I think, with a freelance person, because freelancers are more project based and not. The object isn't to serve the traditionally published audience.
Right.
For me, when I take a project on, I want to know to whom my author wants to sell their book, because that's how I'm going to tailor all of my suggestions.
I was thinking about, I was comparing what you're talking about, developmental editing, to the practice in television using focus groups. You know, so you've got a group of kids who are watching a skit in Sesame Street and trying to figure out whether it's getting as much crop or they enjoy it. Or an audience that's watching a sitcom that's maybe going to get greenlit, trying to see what they think of it. Is there anything, so this is, you're actually interacting with your audience and seeing if they're confused or engaged by different parts of the story. Is there anything that happens like that with books?
Are you talking about like beta readers? Like, so the question was about focus groups and how that might apply. Am I getting your question right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that can certainly give you very valuable information. It doesn't necessarily give you what a developmental editor would, but if you are getting feedback from avid science fiction readers, then they may be able to give you some really helpful advice, and that will help you with your story. And that's just another, I know some people, in fact, another tip for saving money on developmental editing, that some developmental editors will do a beta read for you for a lower price. And that's another, that the beta readers are like that focus group. They give you feedback. It won't necessarily be, this is the problem here, but they can tell you, they can point you in the direction of what's not working.
So where do you draw the line between beta reader and developmental editor?
Well, a developmental editor is going to help you with a more comprehensive, like, this is where your story is not working on the big, in the big picture, and then within the smaller sections as well. And it'll be a comprehensive review of your manuscript, as opposed to a beta reader is going to read through and say, yeah, you lost me here. I thought this was weird. I really liked this. More of this, please. That kind of thing. Generally.
What are the most common problems you encounter?
Most common problems I encounter, those things that I talked about, like conflict, lack of structure, the lack of transitions. You have, scenes without conflict, and just making sure that scenes have all the components that they're supposed to have, and that kind of thing. And yeah, I would say. And then beyond that, it's every manuscript has its own special problems or, challenges, really. I mean, and the thing is, that to understand that knowing where the problems are is the key to figuring them out. So not to be afraid of finding out that you have a problem, because it's all, like it's all geared toward helping you make your book the very best book it can be. So you had a question.
I was just going to say, I agree with that. The independent editor like yourself is different from, say, the formulaic or the type of thing that you were talking about.
Right, agency guidelines.
Yeah, where you're in that situation, and so it's more of a craft approach, I would think. In saying that, you might, like I'm writing a very big, large-scale science fiction work. You might be a great editor to help me with that. There might be some others out there that would also do a good job, but maybe not quite so much if they're not so much into that particular genre. They may have different points of view or approaches. How would someone go about kind of vetting and choosing the right developmental editor within the craft freelance field?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, how do you find a good developmental editor for your project? Because different genres, different people have different specialities and different expertise. And so how do you find them? I think, and first of all, that you talk to other people who write in your genre, whose books look good. People who tell a good story, and ask, say, hey, who's your editor? And if they don't use an editor, that's fine. You've just paid them a huge compliment. So that'll be cool. That'll be cool for them. I think also, groups like this and other forums, like just occasionally, just, hey, who's got a great editor in sci-fi? And just, so asking around. And then Matt, actually, when we were at Brainstorm ATEX, he had a great suggestion for how do you personally find out if the person is right. And this, I think, works better for copy editing. But to actually have someone, hire someone to do 5 or 10 pages of your manuscript, and to just give you an idea, have a couple, 2, 3, 4, do a short sample of your work and then compare them. Now, for developmental editing, that's going to be a little different. But what you can do is get, like, if you work from an outline, correct, make the changes that you made as you went through and wrote it, right? Because you probably didn't. Do you write with an outline? Or
Kind of part and part.
Okay.
I use a general outline to keep me from drifting off into rabbit trails.
So a fairly detailed sentence outline, and then and you could get that reviewed for, depending on the editor, a couple hundred, 300, 400 maybe at the most. I wouldn't pay more than that for that, unless they were I don't know.
Right.
Sparkly unicorns or something, but the point is to like have them take a look at it and see who offers you the best suggestions, because that's going to be somebody who gets your story is the person you want working with you.
Right, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So by a detailed sentence outline, do you mean a synopsis?
Well, so
Pretty detailed, like a 12-page synopsis or something like that.
right, yeah. What do I mean by a detailed sentence outline, and is that a synopsis? And yeah, I mean that like it hits all of the high points, right, as you go through the story. So you might have a sentence or two per scene, or a little less or a little more, roughly. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Forgive me if I don't ask this correctly. But anyway, my big idea is along the lines of a how-to book. Okay. So as far as getting either a copy, well, not a copy editor because that's when you're completely finished, but your structural editor, since I'm going to be more or less retelling the same story, but in a different venue or whatever throughout the whole book. adequate enough to just give them one chapter and say, this is what it is?
Okay, so the question is if you have a nonfiction book and you said that every chapter is going to be roughly the same, or
Say I wrote a book on how to use a drill.
how to use a drill. Okay,
Chapter 1 is how to use a drill with wood.
okay,
Chapter 2 is how to use a drill on metal. Chapter 3 is how does the dentist drill you? You know.
okay,
Whatever.
right.
You
Ah,
know? So
okay.
it's
So
going to be
can
roughly
that?
the same
Yeah.
thing.
Could that, if you had a particular kind of nonfiction book, could one chapter that's basically the same structure as the rest of the book be used as a sample? I'm just for the recording and
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that could definitely work depending on the project, where it's representative, where you have where you have the same structure in every chapter. That could work for your sample, along with I would give a shorter outline of the whole book with that, just something that has like what is in each chapter, what's in each chapter, and this is my introduction, this is my sample chapter, this is the list of all the chapters, this is my conclusion, maybe. Or even if you don't include the full introduction and conclusion, I would include a few sentences that kind of cover what you cover, maybe a paragraph or two. But yeah, I think that could work depending on the project. If you're talking about drills and going to the dentist.
Well, it's just,
No, I know, that was a good example.
redundancy, of the same thing, but in different,
Yeah, I think that could work.
like the life of a piece of ore, I was a nail, I was a saw, I was a bullet,
Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
What was the nonfiction website that you said at the beginning that pulled apart that book?
That's storygrid.com. So that's, or
Was it?
the nonfiction. I know, like Sean Coyne has the story grid that talks about fiction, but he also on his blog,
Okay, on his
he has, he deconstructed the tipping point there.
Oh, got it. Thank you.
One more question.
Okay, so one more question. Matt's telling me he's got the hook out. He's ready to pull me off. Away from the mic. Any other questions? Burning question. Yes.
In nonfiction, I've written 2 books on the same topic and wrote a 3rd one, but then I realized I want to unleash a series of books. Intuitively it seems like each book has to have complete integrity and, come to great solutions or whatever. But how can you, and this is just like an overall structural question that an editor can help me with, it, how do you embed a desire for other topics within the book, or you just can't do that?
Okay, so if I have your question, are you talking nonfiction or fiction? Nonfiction.
So
Okay.
different kinds of riffs or applications for the same topic.
Different kinds of applications for the same topic. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of the Miracle Morning series. You have the main Miracle Morning, and then you have the Miracle Morning for salespeople, and you have the Miracle Morning for network marketers, and you have the Miracle Morning for writers now, which is awesome. I edited it. So yeah, there's definitely, I think, there's a way that, like if you were going to, like if you came to me and said, I have this idea and I want to, for 10 books on this topic, but I want to go deeply into this here and this here and this here, that we could kind of work it out, like even pre-plan that, your strategy for those, so that you know what you're doing kind of going forward. We could brainstorm and that kind of thing, and that sounds like fun, so let me know if you want to do that. Anyway, well, thank you so much. This was really fun. I could talk about this for hours, so I don't want to do
We're going to
that.
stick around for a little while. So
Yeah,
please
okay,
stay
and I
chat,
will.
we can
And if you
have
have specific questions that you want to ask, no hooks, no catches, no nothing. You can just take
No
my
strings
card.
attached.
No strings attached. Thank you. Where are my metaphors today? They're gone. So, but take one of my cards and feel free to send me a question if you got.
Where are your cards?
I will pull them out. I will pull them out just now.
And so can you just say for the recording where your website is and your podcast that you do?
Yes, I am Leslie Watts editor.com, and I co-host the Writership podcast with Clark Chamberlain, which is awesome and fun.
Great, thanks. So as we said, we're gonna stick around for a while, so please stay and chat and come talk to Leslie and ask any more questions that you have. She's gonna hand out cards and stuff. And then just a couple housekeeping things. So as always, this is a community-funded meetup, so if you liked what you saw today, please consider contributing through meetup.com or through Patreon. We have a crowdfunding campaign. That's at patreon.com/indiepubAustin. And I can give you that address later if you want. Our next meetup is July 31st. It's not going to be here. It's going to be at Opal Divines Penfield, which is on South Congress. And we have a private room. It's called the Scotch Room. And it holds 50 to 70 people. So check that out. And please join us then. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for coming, guys. All right.
That'll be fun.